Jake Carter wasn't afraid of taking shortcuts. At 14, he had grown used to navigating the backroads of his small town, cutting through fields and alleyways to shave off a few extra minutes from his walk home. His favorite route was the overgrown path behind the abandoned fairground, a forgotten stretch of land where weeds grew tall, and rusted carnival remnants still lay half buried in the dirt. The place had always fascinated him. How something that had once been so full of life could be left to decay. Its laughter and music replaced by silence and the occasional whisper of the wind. That afternoon, the sky was heavy with the promise of rain, and Jake quickened his pace, his sneakers crunching against the gravel. He had taken this path 100 times before. But today, something was different. A sound, faint, barely audible over the rustling of leaves, made him stop. A whimper. Jake turned his head, scanning the tangled mess of weeds and broken fencing to his right. At first, he thought he had imagined it. That maybe it was just the wind. But then he heard it again, soft, weak, almost pleading. He hesitated only for a moment before stepping closer, pushing aside the thorny branches that reached out like skeletal fingers. His heart pounded as he moved deeper into the brush, the ground uneven beneath his feet. And then he saw it. A small golden shape, half hidden beneath the wild growth. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he knelt down, his fingers trembling as he pushed the last of the tangled vines aside. There, caught in the rusted remains of an old chain-link fence, was a tiny golden retriever puppy. The pup's hind leg was twisted in the metal, the sharp wire cutting into its fur. Dried blood clung to its soft golden coat, and its body looked far too thin. Its eyes fluttered open at the sound of Jake's movement, dull and exhausted, but still holding a glimmer of awareness. "Hey, buddy," Jake whispered, his voice barely steady. "It's okay, I got you." The puppy whimpered but didn't move. Too weak to fight. Jake's mind raced. He knew he couldn't free the pup alone. The wire was too tight. And one wrong move might make things worse. He needed help. Frantically, he pulled out his phone and dialed his mother's number. "Mom," he said as soon as she picked up. "I found a puppy. It's stuck in some old fencing behind the fairground. And it's hurt bad." There was a pause, then the familiar, calm voice of his mother, used to handling her son's impulsive rescues of stray animals. "Where exactly are you?" she asked. "By the south fence, near the old carousel ruins," he said, glancing around to orient himself. "Can you call Dr. Hayes? The puppy's bleeding." "I'll call her now. Stay with him, Jake. Try to keep him calm." Jake ended the call and looked down at the little dog, his heart aching at the sight. He reached out slowly, letting the puppy sniff his hand, though he barely seemed to have the energy to respond. "You're gonna be all right," Jake murmured. "Help's coming." "Okay." Minutes felt like hours as he sat there, murmuring soft reassurances. The rain began to drizzle, cool droplets landing on his skin. But he didn't move. He wasn't about to leave the puppy alone. Then, the sound of footsteps. Jake turned to see his mother approaching, followed closely by Dr. Emily Hayes, the town's veterinarian. The sight of her familiar face, lined with years of experience and kindness, filled him with relief. Dr. Hayes knelt beside him immediately, her expert eyes assessing the situation. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, reaching out to stroke the puppy's head gently. "You've been through quite an ordeal, haven't you?" The pup barely reacted, but Jake swore its body relaxed slightly at her touch. "We need to cut the wire," she said. "I have clippers in my bag." "Hold him steady, Jake." Jake nodded, his hands gently cradling the pup's body as Dr. Hayes carefully worked the cutters through the rusted metal. The process was slow, precise. One wrong movement and the wire could dig in deeper. Jake held his breath. And then, a snap. The wire loosened. Dr. Hayes moved quickly, freeing the injured leg with practiced care. The puppy let out a tiny whimper. But when Jake stroked its ears, it didn't pull away. "He's free," Jake breathed, feeling the tension in his chest finally release. Dr. Hayes wasn't finished. She examined the pup's leg, her brow furrowing. "The wound is deep, but I don't think the bone is broken. He's malnourished, dehydrated, but he's a fighter." She met Jake's gaze, her expression soft. "You did good, Jake. If you hadn't found him, he might not have made it through the night." Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. "Will he be okay?" Dr. Hayes nodded, with care. "Yes. Let's get him back to my clinic." Jake didn't hesitate. "I'll carry him." Carefully, he lifted the puppy into his arms. The little body was light. Too light, but for the first time, he felt warmth in the small creature's fur. The puppy sighed, pressing into him, as if already understanding that he was safe now. Jake's mother placed a hand on his shoulder. Her eyes filled with pride. As they made their way back to town, Jake kept glancing down at the bundle in his arms, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of the puppy's chest. He had found him in a forgotten place, in the middle of rust and ruin. But now, he wasn't lost anymore. Now, he had a chance. And though Jake didn't know it yet, that little puppy would change his life in ways he never expected. A name formed in his mind. One that seemed right. One that fit. "Max," he whispered. "You're Max." The puppy's tail twitched, just slightly, and for the first time, Jake knew he hadn't just found Max. They had found each other. The moment Dr. Hayes clipped the last strand of rusted wire from the little golden retriever's injured leg, she knew time was of the essence. The pup was weak, barely able to lift its head. But there was still life in his eyes, a flicker of something that had not yet been extinguished. She had seen that look before in countless animals that had suffered, that had been abandoned or lost but still clung to hope. This little one was no different. Jake held his breath as she carefully lifted the puppy from the tangled mess of wire, cradling him in her arms with practiced gentleness. The pup whimpered softly but didn't fight, too exhausted to resist. His fur was dirty, matted in places, and his thin frame told a story of neglect. But he was here now, and that meant he had a chance. "We need to get him to the clinic," Dr. Hayes said firmly. "His leg is in bad shape. And he's dehydrated. The sooner we treat him, the better." Jake nodded, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline of it all. He wasn't sure why. But he felt a deep, unshakable responsibility for this little dog. It wasn't just about saving him, it was about what came next. About making sure he never had to suffer again. His mother offered to drive, and Jake sat in the backseat, holding the small, fragile body against his chest. He could feel the puppy's slow, steady breathing, the faint rise and fall of his ribs. Every few moments, he whispered reassurances, hoping the sound of his voice might bring some comfort. "You're gonna be okay, buddy," he murmured. "Just hang in there." By the time they reached the clinic, Dr. Hayes had already called ahead, and her small staff was waiting. Jake followed as she carried the puppy inside, the bright, sterile smell of the clinic filling his senses. Dr. Hayes wasted no time. She set the pup gently on the exam table, her movements swift but careful. Jake stood close, watching intently as she began her work. "First things first," she said, running her hands gently over the dog's small frame. "No collar, no tags, and no microchip." She glanced at Jake, her expression knowing, no sign that anyone was looking for him. Jake swallowed hard. He had suspected as much. Dr. Hayes turned back to the pup, checking his gums, his pulse, his breathing. She cleaned the wound carefully, rinsing away the dirt and dried blood with warm saline. The sight of the raw, torn skin made Jake wince. But the pup barely reacted. He was too weak, too spent. "He's dehydrated," Dr. Hayes said, her tone clinical but kind. "Malnourished, too. He hasn't been eating well. Maybe for a long time." She reached for an IV bag, hanging it from the stand before carefully inserting a small catheter into the pup's leg. "Fluids first. Then we'll get some food in him." Jake watched as the clear liquid dripped steadily down the line, bringing hydration and strength back into the little body. "What about his leg?" Jake asked. Dr. Hayes wrapped the wound with gauze, securing it with gentle but firm hands. "No broken bones, which is a small miracle. But the cut was deep. He'll need antibiotics, rest, and time to heal." She glanced up at Jake. "And someone to make sure he's not alone." Jake didn't hesitate. "I'll be here," he said. Dr. Hayes smiled. "I had a feeling you would." It was late by the time everything was done. The puppy, still weak but stable, was settled onto a soft blanket in one of the clinic's kennels. Jake knelt beside him, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. "You need a name," Jake said softly. The pup's eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, met his for a brief moment. And that was it. The moment Jake knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't just some lost dog he had rescued. It was fate. "Max," he whispered. "Your name is Max." Max's tail twitched, just barely, but it was enough. In the days that followed, Jake made good on his promise. He came to the clinic every afternoon after school, walking straight past the front desk to the back room where Max was recovering. He brought treats, small bites of soft food that Max could eat without straining himself. He read books out loud, not caring if Max understood, just wanting him to hear a voice, to know he wasn't alone. The first few days were slow. Max mostly slept, his body using all its energy to heal. But each day, Jake saw small changes. The way Max lifted his head when he entered the room. The way his tail wagged, just slightly, when Jake unwrapped a treat. The way his eyes, once dull and tired, started to brighten. Dr. Hayes noted his progress with quiet approval. "He's strong," she told Jake one evening as they watched Max drift off to sleep. "Stronger than I expected, but I think a lot of that has to do with you." Jake felt a warmth in his chest. He had never had a dog before, never known what it was like to care for something so completely. But now, he couldn't imagine not coming to see Max every day. One afternoon, after nearly a week, Jake sat beside Max's kennel, flipping through a book as the pup rested. Then, without warning, something amazing happened. Max, slow but deliberate, pushed himself up onto his front legs and took a wobbly step forward. Jake's eyes widened. Max took another step, his injured leg still wrapped in its bandage but no longer tucked uselessly beneath him. And then, just like that, he wagged his tail. It wasn't hesitant this time. It wasn't weak. It was full of life. Jake grinned, reaching through the kennel bars to scratch Max's ears. "You're gonna be just fine, buddy," he said. Max licked his fingers. And in that moment, Jake knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a rescue. This was the beginning of something more. Jake had never been the kind of kid to jump to conclusions. But something about the man set every alarm off in his head the moment he walked into the clinic. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard and cold, darting eyes that never seemed to settle. There was something in the way he carried himself. Something that felt off, not just confident, but entitled, like he expected people to listen to him without question. "I'm here for my dog," the man said, his voice rough and low as he glanced around the clinic's reception area. His gaze settled on Dr. Hayes, then flickered to Jake, who was standing beside the counter, his heart already pounding. Dr. Hayes remained calm, her years of experience evident in the way she met his gaze without a hint of intimidation. "What dog are you referring to?" she asked evenly. "The golden retriever pup, the one you've got in the back," the man said. "He's mine." Jake stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. "Max?" This guy was claiming Max. Dr. Hayes didn't react right away. Instead, she folded her arms, her face unreadable. "Do you have any proof of ownership?" The man blinked, as if the question surprised him. "I don't need proof. He's my dog." Dr. Hayes arched an eyebrow. "If he belongs to you, surely you have something? Vet records, pictures, a microchip registration." The man's jaw tightened. "I don't have any of that. But I know my own dog." Jake clenched his fists. He wanted to speak, to tell the man he was lying. But before he could, Dr. Hayes turned to one of the vet techs standing nearby. "Could you bring Max out here? Please?" Jake's heart raced as the young woman disappeared into the back. He knew what was coming. He knew Max, knew the way he responded to kindness, to familiarity. If this man was really his owner, Max would show some sign of recognition. But when Max was brought into the room, his reaction said everything. The moment his golden paws touched the tile floor, he froze. His body tensed, his ears flattened, and his tail, normally wagging excitedly at the sight of anyone he liked, curled tightly between his legs. He took one look at the man and whimpered, backing up against the vet tech's legs, trying to make himself as small as possible. Jake felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. That wasn't how a dog reacted to its owner. The man's expression darkened. "See, he remembers me." Dr. Hayes remained impassive. "He looks terrified." The man scowled. "He's just nervous. Been away from home too long." Jake couldn't keep quiet any longer. "That's a lie," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "He's scared of you." The man's eyes snapped to Jake, narrowing slightly. "And who are you, kid?" Jake lifted his chin. "The one who found him." For a moment, the air in the room felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. The man's lips curled into something that might have been a smirk if it weren't so laced with irritation. Dr. Hayes spoke before he could. "Unless you can provide proof of ownership, I can't release this dog to you." The man's eyes flashed. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious." His face reddened with anger, his fingers clenching into fists at his sides. He took a step forward, towering over Dr. Hayes. But she didn't flinch. "You don't get to decide," he growled. "Actually, I do," she said coolly. "This is a veterinary clinic. And as of now, Max is under my care. Without proof of ownership, legally, you have no claim here." For a moment, Jake thought the man might do something, lunge, shout, cause a scene, but instead, he exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. "Fine," he spat, "but this isn't over." He turned on his heel, storming toward the door. Before stepping outside, he glanced back over his shoulder, his gaze locking onto Jake's. "I'll be back," he said, his voice low and full of warning. Then he was gone. A heavy silence filled the clinic after the door slammed shut. Max let out a shaky whimper, pressing himself against Jake's leg. Jake immediately knelt beside him, running his fingers through the pup's soft fur. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." Dr. Hayes let out a slow breath, rubbing her temples. That man wasn't telling the truth. Jake nodded. Max would have recognized him if he was. Dr. Hayes looked thoughtful. "I'll notify the local authorities, just in case." Jake appreciated that. But even as she spoke, something inside him felt unsettled. The way the man had looked at him before leaving, it wasn't the look of someone who had given up. It was the look of someone who was planning something. That night, as Jake lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He kept replaying the day's events in his mind. The way Max had cowered. The way the man had spoken. The way his presence had made Jake's skin crawl. Then, just as he was finally drifting into an uneasy sleep, something made his eyes snap open. A sound. A low rumble outside his window. Jake sat up, his pulse quickening as he moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Parked across the street, half hidden in the shadows, was a black truck. Jake's stomach twisted. Even though he couldn't see the driver, he knew the man was watching. Jake swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the curtain. He didn't know what this man wanted, didn't know what he was willing to do. But one thing was clear. Max wasn't safe. And neither was he. Jake had never known what it felt like to be truly afraid. Not in the way he was now. Sure, he had felt fear before. The kind that came with a difficult test or a late-night horror movie. But this was different. This fear was real. It was a constant presence. Lingering in the shadows outside his home. A creeping unease that made his stomach twist every time he looked over his shoulder. The man had started watching him. It wasn't just the truck parked across the street that first night, though that had been bad enough. Over the next few days, Jake saw him everywhere, walking slowly past his house, lingering too long at the corner store, standing just outside the vet clinic as if daring someone to confront him. He never did anything outright illegal, never crossed the threshold into something that could get him arrested. But the message was clear. I know where you are. I haven't forgotten. Max is mine. Jake tried to ignore it at first. He told himself that the police had been notified, that his parents were keeping an eye on things. But it wasn't enough. Every time he left the house, every time he visited Max at the clinic, the anxiety gnawed at him. And then the threats started. It was little things at first. Scraps of paper tucked into the mailbox with messages scrawled in rough, uneven handwriting. You can't keep him from me. Enjoy him while you can. Then there was the dead rat left near their porch one morning. Its tiny body stiff and cold. Jake's mother had gasped when she saw it. But Jake already knew who had done it. They called the police again. But without actual proof, there was little they could do. It's intimidation, one of the officers admitted. But unless he makes a direct threat or tries to take the dog by force, we can't arrest him. It wasn't enough. Jake knew he had to do something. That was when he decided to find Rachel Bennett. He had heard her name from one of the vet techs at Dr. Hayes's clinic, a woman who had once lived with the man who was now making his life miserable. If anyone knew what he was capable of, it was her. With Dr. Hayes's help, he tracked her down. She lived just outside of town, in a small house surrounded by trees, far away from prying eyes. When she opened the door, Jake was met with a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled back, her face lined with exhaustion. "You're the boy with the dog," she said, her voice guarded. Jake nodded. "His name is Max." For a moment, she didn't say anything, then she let out a slow sigh and stepped aside. "Come in." The house was simple but tidy, filled with the scent of coffee and old books. She led him to the kitchen, where she poured herself a cup but didn't offer him one. "I figured it was only a matter of time before someone came asking about him," she said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "You know him?" Jake asked. Rachel let out a humorless laugh. "I knew him. I lived with him for 3 years." She shook her head. "Worst mistake of my life." Jake hesitated. "Did he hurt me?" She finished for him. "No, not in the way you're thinking. But he hurt other things." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "Animals. Mostly. I should have left sooner. Should have reported him. But I was scared." Jake swallowed hard. Max was his, wasn't he? Rachel sighed. "If you can call it that. He got him as a puppy. Barely old enough to be weaned. Kept him outside. barely fed him, never took him to the vet. If Max didn't learn fast enough, he got hit. If he made too much noise, he got locked in a crate for hours. She shook her head, and then one day, he just left him. Said he wasn't worth the trouble. Didn't even look back. Jake clenched his fists under the table. And now he wants him back. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. Of course he does. Not because he cares, but because you care. Because someone else sees value in something he threw away. Jake felt a knot of anger and determination tighten in his chest. "Can you help me?" Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Yeah," she said, "I can." With Rachel's testimony, things moved quickly. Dr. Hayes helped Jake's family file an official report, detailing the abuse Max had suffered. Rachel signed an affidavit, outlining everything she had witnessed during her time with the man. Then, with the support of their lawyer, they took the next step, filing an official request for legal custody of Max. It wasn't an easy process. The man fought back, showing up at the courthouse with angry words and empty threats. He claimed Max was his property, that Jake had stolen him. But when asked for proof, for any record that he had ever cared for Max, he had nothing. No vet records, no receipts, not even a single picture of Max in his home. Jake, on the other hand, had everything. He had Dr. Hayes's medical reports, showing the state Max had been in when he was rescued. He had photographs of Max curled up beside him, of his slow but steady recovery, of the way his golden fur had regained its shine. He had Rachel's sworn statement, detailing the abuse and abandonment. Most importantly, he had Max himself. The judge allowed Jake to bring Max into the courtroom on the final day of the hearing. As soon as they entered, Max's tail wagged excitedly, his whole body wiggling with happiness as he pressed against Jake's leg. Then he saw him. The moment Max's eyes locked onto the man, his entire demeanor changed. His tail dropped, his ears flattened, and he backed up behind Jake, his body trembling. The courtroom was silent. That was all it took. The ruling was swift. Max was officially Jake's. As they left the courthouse that day, Jake knelt beside Max, wrapping his arms around him as the pup licked his face, his tail once again wagging with excitement. "You're safe now," Jake whispered, and for the first time, he truly believed it. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that came just before dawn. The world outside Jake's window was wrapped in shadows. The only sounds the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the faint hum of crickets in the distance. It should have been peaceful. It should have been just another ordinary night. But something wasn't right. Max knew it before Jake did. The little golden retriever had been curled up at the foot of Jake's bed, his breathing slow and steady in sleep. But suddenly, he lifted his head, his ears pricked forward, his body tense. Then, a low, barely audible growl rumbled from his chest. Jake stirred, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "Max," he whispered, still half asleep. Max didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on the window. His muscles coiled as though ready to spring. That was when Jake heard it, the faint creak of the back gate swinging open. His stomach clenched. For a split second, he thought he was imagining it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But then Max let out a sharp bark, and Jake's heart started pounding. He threw off his blankets, creeping toward the window, careful not to make a sound. His fingers trembled as he pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. And then he froze. There, in the dim glow of the security light, a shadow moved through the backyard. A tall, hulking figure dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by the brim of a cap. But Jake didn't need to see his face to know who it was. The man had come back. Jake's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. What should he do? Call his parents? Run downstairs? But he didn't have time to think, because at that moment, the man reached toward Max's doghouse, holding something in his hand. A leash. He was trying to steal Max. Jake didn't hesitate. He lunged for his phone and hit the emergency call button, his voice urgent but controlled as he whispered into the receiver, "There's someone in my backyard. He's trying to take my dog." The dispatcher's voice was calm but firm. "Stay inside. Officers are on the way." But Jake wasn't going to just stand there and do nothing. He turned toward Max, who was still growling, his body tense with alarm. "Stay with me, buddy," Jake whispered. Then he moved, quiet but fast, through the hallway, down the stairs, toward the back door. His parents must have heard him because he barely made it to the kitchen before they appeared, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Jake," his father whispered. Jake pointed toward the backyard. "He's here." That was all it took. His dad grabbed the baseball bat he kept near the door, his mother reaching for the house phone. But before anyone could do anything, flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. The police had arrived. The man had barely made it to the fence when the officers flooded into the yard, their voices sharp and commanding. "Hands where we can see them. Step away from the dog." Jake watched, his heart racing, as the man hesitated for a brief moment, then, realizing he was caught, raised his hands slowly. It was over. The officers moved swiftly, cuffing him and leading him toward the patrol car. Jake saw the flicker of anger in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he glanced toward the house. But there was nothing he could do now. The next morning, the security footage confirmed everything. The cameras had caught the entire incident, him sneaking in, trying to leash Max, attempting to steal him away in the dead of night. There was no denying it now. When the case finally went to court, Jake sat beside his parents, his hands clasped tightly together, Max resting at his feet. The courtroom was filled with quiet murmurs, the tension thick in the air as the judge reviewed the evidence. Then, the verdict came: trespassing, violation of a restraining order, attempted theft of personal property. The man was sentenced, barred from ever coming near Jake or his family again. And most importantly, the judge made it clear: Max was Jake's dog. Now and forever. Jake had won. As they walked out of the courthouse, the weight that had been pressing on Jake's chest for weeks finally lifted. He looked down at Max, who wagged his tail happily. oblivious to the legal battle that had just secured his future. They were safe now. That evening, Jake sat on the front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky streaked with soft oranges and purples. Max sat beside him, his golden fur glowing in the fading light. Jake reached down, running his fingers through the dog's thick coat, feeling the warmth beneath his palm. He thought about everything they had been through together, the night he had found Max, the days spent at the vet clinic, the fear, the fights, the battle to keep him safe. It had all led to this moment. Jake smiled, leaning down to press his forehead lightly against Max's. "You're safe now, Max," he whispered. My. And Max, as if understanding every word, wagged his tail and licked Jake's hand, because he knew he was finally home.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.